with them, just to try and bring some of the challenges, adventures they had alive for us. Just to set the scene, when military occupation of the Glenkens took place, seeking to enforce the wishes of King Charles II that the Episcopalian system of church government might be imposed on the people, many of the Covenanters who stood firm on retaining the Presbyterian form of church government found themselves under severe pressure, fined heavily for non-attendance at church worship under the newly appointed curates, and threatened with imprisonment. Many sought refuge in the hills, in hideouts in the surrounding countryside, where they were secretly nurtured by sympathisers. As the troubles continued, and many were marked as rebels because of their involvement in events like the Glenkens Rising or the Battle of Bothwell Bridge, their very lives were in danger. When we think of the weather we have to endure in Galloway, it often can't have been an easy life living out in the wilds through all seasons. It must have been cold and damp and dispiriting, and they must have constructed secret hideouts to make life a little more tolerable. And as I say, over the years I've kept an eye out for what I suspect may be some of these hideouts, and I share some of these with you today. William Gordon of Earlston Castle was a strong supporter of the Covenanters and was fined heavily and persecuted greatly by the military. In the end, he was killed in 1679 as he arrived late at the Battle of Bothwell Bridge in Lanarkshire. His son Alexander escaped from the battle and eluded his pursuers by entering a cottage and putting on woman's clothes, rocking a cradle while the soldiers searched houses and rode by. He returned to Earlston, but was soon outlawed and his estates later sold. He escaped to Holland for a while, but then returned to Scotland, where he lay low to avoid capture. For a time, troops were billeted in Earlston Castle, and when they were absent, he sometimes returned to sleep in his own bed, only quick actions enabling him to elude capture on a number of occasions. Sometimes he escaped into the Earlston oak, this fine tree still just clinging on to life. Last remnants of it you can see here. It must have been a huge tree in those days, some 300 or 400 years ago. And he would hide there until the soldiers departed and then slip off into the woods to his other hideout. My favourite story concerning Alexander, however, was of the time he was warned that soldiers were on the way and quickly changed. He knew he didn't have time to get to the oak, so he quickly changed into the clothes of a working man. And he was busy chopping wood in the courtyard of the castle, helped by a female servant, when soldiers rode up. The commander asked the wood cleavers if Earlston was within, and when he replied no, he was asked to throw down his axe and join in the search. He complied immediately, no photo pictures in those days, and he seemed to enter into the search of the castle as heartily as the soldiers themselves. When they couldn't find Alexander, they asked their guide if he knew where his master's hiding place was in the woods. Not wanting to lie, he replied, referring to another master, Jesus Christ. His master, he said, had no hiding place that he knew of, and he was certain that if he understood that any person was seeking him, he would show himself before very long. And the soldiers went off mystified, having failed to find Alexander, unaware that they'd actually be talking to him. But to turn to the subject of that hiding place in the woods, the old 6-inch Ormond survey map of 1849 marks a ruined chapel in Earlston Wood. And I came across a fascinating passage in Robert Simpson's book, Traditions of the Covenanters, which was published in 1841. I should mention at this point that Simpson writes in the typical flowery language of the time, and certainly rather romanticises the whole story of the Covenanters. But I've come to the conclusion that he has preserved a remarkably accurate record of things that happened in those days. I believe he tapped into the folk memory of the local people and gathered up stories that had passed down the generations by word of mouth. So inevitably, there are some inaccuracies. but he has managed to capture a vivid snapshot of life in those troubled times. And he writes of William Gordon of Earlston and Alexander. William Gordon of Earlston was the proprietor of Earlston in the persecuting times. His Covenanting principles rendered him obnoxious to the ruling party, and accordingly his house was made a garrison for Bannatyne and his troopers. The worthy man, being expelled from his own dwelling, constructed for himself a hiding place in the deep and impenetrable thickets in the vicinity of the mansion house, in which on many occasions he found a secure retreat. It does not appear that the resort was ever discovered by the enemy during the years of careful search that were made for the obnoxious members of that household. The existence of such a place was rumoured by tradition among the people of the neighbourhood, but no person could tell where it was. Its discovery, however, was made of late years by an inhabitant of the village of Dalry, who was one day searching the woods not far from the castle. It is a small, narrow building in the heart of the thickest and most impervious underwood, and even at the present time, when the forest is much less dense than it must formerly have been, is almost undiscoverable. Here, in this secrecy, did the worthy William Gordon and his son Alexander, the companion of his sufferings, often hide themselves in the day of peril. And this was the oratory in which many fervent prayers were addressed to the throne of grace by those sufferers for conscience's sake. Next photo, please. I managed to locate their hiding place back in 2003 and will be happy to show it to any who might be interested to see it. It's not too difficult to get to now. Why was it called a chapel? It's just a simple little dwelling. Of course, you would have camouflaged it well in the undergrowth there. Probably he chose a special place where there was a thick underbrush around. Low walls, no doubt, well camouflaged by either bracken or turf, probably a turf roof, perhaps covered with sapling, just to disguise it, so that people would almost trip over it before they would actually come across it. But a place where they could at least get some shelter from the rain and the bad weather, just within a stone, not much more than a stone's throw of the castle. Why was it called a chapel in the first Ordnance Survey map, though? The Ordnance Survey name book, compiled to accompany the map, says, "It is said to have been erected by Gordon of Earlston after the period of the Scottish persecution in 1668 to commemorate the spot where the ejected minister of the parish and his congregation had often met for public worship. Hence the name Old Chapel." That may be so. But the likelihood is that through much of the Covenanting times, it was invaluable as a place to lie low and avoid the patrolling dragoons. The Gordons of Lardmore up the Gareth Glen were strong supporters of the Covenanting cause. I'm at present trying to unravel the family relationships. Roger, the patriarch of the family, died in 1662. Andrew, next photo, please. Just at the start of the Troubles, and hence the names on the family tombstone near the entrance to Kells Church, the flat tabletop just at the front there. I think it needs a bit of cleaning up again. It's quite hard to work out what exactly it says now. It needs a bit of a cleaning. The tombstone also mentions his grandson John, who took part in the Glenkens uprising, and after making it home from the Battle of Rallying Green, died of his wounds soon after. William Gordon of Lardmore presented Kells Church with its bell in 1722, and there is a plaque on the bell tower which records him as being the son of James Gordon. Next photo, please. You can read here, William Gordon, son to J.A. James Gordon, and I'm not quite sure, it seems to be J:"Oye, to Lardmore, gifted this bell, 1722. I'm not quite sure what the last line says. It seems to end with 1794. I'm not quite sure what the significance of that date is. But intriguing to have been able to decipher that with my, zooming in with my camera, my digital camera, I was able to work it out. Simpson, in his book, 1841, I suspect that, Simpson in his book 1841 book, Traditions of the Covenanters, recounts the adventures and close calls that Roger Gordon of Largmore had. And I strongly suspect that James, who survived until 1730, well after the Troubles, is that same Roger. He was perhaps named Roger James after his father, but to avoid confusion with his father, generally went by the name of James. James had a son named William, who was a merchant up in Glasgow, and he most likely decided to present the bell to Kells Church in thankfulness to God for his father having survived the times of persecution. In his chapter on Roger Gordon of Largmore, Simpson writes the following, referring to a time Roger escaped from the dragoons one night when they surprised him at Largmore. He writes, "He then repaired with all convenient speed to his accustomed hiding place in one of the lofty ranges of the Galloway Mountains, called the Mill or Meal A place of greater solitude than this can scarcely be found, and a retreat which, in the night season, it was impossible for the troopers to find." His name for the mountain is a bit garbled, and to my mind this is clear evidence that he was attempting to write down stories that to be shared with him orally. But I'm sure he is referring to Meikle Millier. Roger held Clenby at the top of the Garrett Glen as well, so it would make sense that he might have built a refuge on the higher reaches of his own land, where he would have been unlikely to have been troubled by soldiers. Last year, when climbing the mountain with my family, I came across the ruins of a small building high up on the shoulder of the mountain. I only noticed the ruin when I was almost upon it, and he would have likely camouflaged it with heather and given it a turf roof, perhaps with saplings covered by turf, so that it would have been even less visible in those days. As Michael Ansell has rightly pointed out, if it had been a summer sheen, one might have expected to find some small buildings. And this building really seems to be too high up for it to be a sheen. I'm convinced it was Roger's secret hideout. Another photo, please. There you can see it close up, looking down the hill. It's a very simple little dwelling, no outlet, but so high up you wonder, it seems to fit totally with being Roger Gordon's hideout up in the hills. One of the two gravestones for Covenanters in Kells churchyard is for a local man by the name of Adam McQuan. For safety, he spent much of his time hiding up in the high Galloway hills. On the 1 to 25,000 Ordnance Survey map, you will find McQuan's Stone, marked by the side of the Carnelloch Burn, 9 miles west of New Galloway, where Adam fashioned a secret hideout. Today, next photo please, this boulder is passed by a... Oh, jumped around for a second. That's it? Right. Well, that's the grave of Adam McQuan in here we go. There's one just before that. That's it, yes. Thank you. There's the Adam McQuan stone just beside the forest track. And he would, and next photo then, again. Oh, no. Yeah. I guess he probably built a little shelter against the boulder where...
I'm not touching it.
Not Gremlin. Right, so well, yeah, right.
It's too down your own.
Don't touch it right there. McQuan had contracted a fever and became extremely unwell and was forced to return to his home, which stood just outside New Galloway, to seek refuge. Shortly after this, at the height of the clean times in 1685, Colonel James Douglas arrived at his home, where he lay on his sickbed and barged into the house, pushing past his family who were caring for him. Finding the Covenanter lying there, he put questions to him. but for some reason McQuan was either unwilling or perhaps unable to answer these. "Drag him to New Galloway," Douglas ordered. His soldiers took the sick man to the Royal Borough, where he was locked up for the night in the town hall jail. A couple of days later, he was brought out and shot in the centre of the village. No trial had taken place. McQuan's body was later carried to Kells churchyard and buried secretly by friends. Shall we try and go on to it? Yes, you can see the whole story. Here lies Adam McQuan, who, being sick of a fever, was taken, and you can read the whole story on both sides. The original stone has been set in Victorian times, was set into a larger stone, which was just to help preserve it. You can see it there in Kells Church. And the other side of the stone of the next photo. Yes. Finally, I mention hiding places associated with Covenanter John Dempster. He lived at Galley Yard, up on the hillside above the Black Water, upstream from where the youth hostel used to be. Though now you can hardly make out the foundations of his house. He was present at the Battle of Bothwell Bridge, and his strong Covenanting loyalties meant he was remorselessly hounded by the troops for a number of years. Simpson, in his book, tells his story well, and I'll read some extracts for you. He followed the occupation of a tailor, and was one of the patriots who fought at Bothwell Bridge. Being a noted nonconformist, a strict search was frequently made for him in the district where he resided. So intent were his enemies on his apprehension that he was obliged to leave his house and to seek an abode in the woods and caves in the neighbourhood. He selected a hiding place in the rugged side of the Black Water. Next photo, please. Yes. A stream which emptied itself into the Silvery Ken a few miles above the village of Dalry. The cave of the rock in which he lodged was the place where in the summer months he plied his trade, while his wife conveyed his food to him by stealth. I believe I found this hideout on the edge of the Black Water at about its nearest point to Galley Yard. Perhaps not exactly a cave, you can see it under the round tree there, but a well-camouflaged hollow on the edge of the river. Next photo, please. Standing above it, you are quite unaware of its existence. Perhaps a little damp at times, but if he had made a little platform with sticks to raise himself a few inches above the floor and covered it with bracken, he could have had quite a cosy den in which to ply his trade as a tailor. Not much more than a stone's throw from his house, but very well hidden. At one time when he was nearly caught, Simpson tells us Dempster decided it would be safer to find a hideout a bit further away from his house. A good friend of his had a hideout in a cave on a hill near New Galloway, and he decided to go and join him there. However, not that long afterwards, they received a warning that their hideout had been betrayed to the troops. Simpson continues his story as follows. On receiving this friendly caution, John and his friend left the cave to seek concealment elsewhere. As they were traversing the hill, they observed a company of troopers who, guided by an informer, were coming directly to the cavern which they had just abandoned. They now plainly perceived that the warning they had received was not without ground, and that their only security lay in the speed of their flight. The dragoons, who by this time had them fully in their view, commenced a vigorous pursuit. The fugitives directed their course towards Loch Ken, a beautiful sheet of water which stretches along the valley in the line of the River Ken, below New Galloway. They next turned in the direction of Balmaclellan, and they were about to ascend the little eminence that leads to the village when they perceived that they were out of their enemy's view. And seizing their advantage, they turned to a linn in the Garple Glen, at a short distance from the place where they were, in which they had formerly found shelter, and which had been a place of retreat to many a wanderer in those fearful times. They reached the cave in safety, and the troopers arrived in Balmaclellan, where they searched every house in which they supposed the men might have taken refuge, but without success, and they were obliged to return to their quarters without their prey. I was curious to find this cave on the Garple, and some years ago searched with no success. Then I heard of others who knew of a cave and renewed my efforts. The Garple burn above the main road descends in a dramatic ravine, and it is quite hard to access, full of broken, fallen down tree trunks and boulders and pretty rough going. But roughly opposite Home House, and on the opposite side of the burn, I came across the following cave in 2015. Next slide, please. Yes. Only a few feet above the normal river level. It is not a natural cave, or at least some of it isn't, but an old mining adit or passageway extending into the hillside. With a head torch, I was able to explore it to its end. And a month or so later, I went back with my sons and measured its length. Next photo. It's about 32 yards long, and I was just able to stand up in it, so it's a sizable passageway. With some standing water in the first part, but then drier, though still damp. It would have been an excellent place to hide, though not the most comfortable. But further research has revealed that this mining adit would not have been there at the time of the Covenanters. It was almost certainly opened up during the 1840s when, after the discovery of the Woodhead lead mine at Carstfairn, further exploration for mineral deposits was taking place in the area. But the adit follows an iron mineralised shear zone and a point of weakness in the rock, so it is very likely that there was a small cave at the entrance at the time of the Covenanters, and that the miners tunnelled back from it into the hillside. So it is very likely that this indeed is the cave that Simpson refers to, and it would have been very hard for the troops to discover. However, in the end, Dempster's luck ran out. Simpson ends his story on Dempster as follows. But though John Dempster escaped for a while from his cruel enemies, he gained at last the martyr's crown. One day when he was returning in the evening twilight from his place of concealment, he was met by a party of Lags men on Knockgrey Hill, that's just near Carstfairn, as they were returning to their garrison in the vicinity of the persecutor's residence. That was at Garryhorn, just outside Carstfairn. John descended the mountain, closely pursued by his enemies, and crossed the water of Dew. The gloom of the evening, however, and the dark heath over which he was fleeing, perplexed his enemies, and in their bewilderment they lost his track. They rode round and round, backwards and forward, in expectation of stumbling upon him in some lurking place, but were disappointed and obliged to abandon their search. John sped to the lofty mountain of Craig Hit, where he found shelter for the night among the crevices of the rocks. Next photo. You can see in the background there part of the Woodhead lead mine. Garryhorn would be just over to the right. Craighit was not a proper place for persons in John's condition, as it was in the full view of Garryhorn, Lag's residence. And had it not been that he was greatly fatigued and overpowered, and perhaps sickly, he never would have allowed the light of day to dawn on him in this situation. Next morning, Lag was at the heart of his troopers for the purpose of searching for wanderers in the neighbourhood. He had his eye on Craig Hit, and thinking that he saw an object in the distance, he brought his telescope to assist his vision. And by this means, he obtained a distinct view of John cowering behind a rock on the hill. On this welcome discovery, he instantly divided his men into two companies. Next photo, please. That was just around the back of the same outcrop. There was another wee bit of a hole. So I think very likely this was the place where John Dempster spent the night, not so far from Garryhorn and the dreaded Grierson of Lag. So on this welcome discovery, Lag instantly divided his men into two companies. The one made a circuit to the south and the other to the west, with a view to circumvent the fugitive. John saw their movements and instantly left his last place of shelter on earth. The scene of the pursuit was in full view of the people of Carstairs, who looked on with absorbing interest and with deep sorrow to see the worthy man pursued like a partridge on the mountain. He left Craighead, crossed the Garry Burn, and hastened to reach the Bow Hill, with the intention of going down the back part of it into Loch Doon, if perchance he might there find another hiding place. The dragoons were pursuing with the utmost eagerness, and as hilariously as if they had been in keen chase after a furtive Reynard. Lag stood below in sight of his men, where he had a full view of all that was passing on the hill, and when, owing to the inequalities of the ground, the soldiers lost sight of the object of their pursuit, he made signs to them, and pointed out the direction in which they were to follow. When John reached the Bow Hill, he became fully aware of his situation, and saw that it was impossible to escape, as his pursuers were just at hand. He gained the height, however, and ran along it for a considerable distance to a point called Meal Hill. Here the dragoons in two divisions met and closed him in. He was now entirely in the power of his ferocious enemies, who exulted in their success as joyously as if they had seized the richest prize. The poor captive, panting and exhausted, was allowed no time to kneel on the heath in prayer, nor to commit his soul formally to him in whose presence he was about to appear as a sufferer in his cause. But though this favour was not granted, he was not unprepared. He had sought the Saviour before, and he had found him, and now he was ready when called on to die in defence of his truth. His capture and death was almost instantaneous, for the merciless troopers shot him dead on the spot. Next picture, please. Up on the ridge of Meal Hill, probably about a quarter of a mile north of the summit, slightly to the west of the boundary fence, you see this stone which was erected on the place where his friends found his body a day or so later, lying up on the hillside. And beside it, there's a small plaque put in I think 1988. Next photo, please, by the Scottish Covenant Memorials Association. On this spot was martyred John Dempster by Grayson of Lag, SCMA 1988. Yes, so that marks a spot where one worthy martyr was finally caught by his persecutors. A few years ago, when exploring on the far side of the Rin of Kells, I came across the ruins of a simple building. Next, please. Above the forestry, high up on the west flank of Coran of Portmark. It's not marked on the maps, and is a very isolated spot. And I can't help wondering if it might also have been a Covenanter refuge. Next photo, please. I think that jumped over. Did you jump over a couple? Oh, right, that's fine.
That's okay.
Perhaps it was precisely that place that Dempster was heading for when the troops caught up with him. That whole wilderness area would have been a natural place for the Covenanters to seek refuge. Next photo, please. I think it's probably see. Yeah. It could just be a shepherd's summer shooting, but I leave that to your judgments. So high up, it would have been a natural place in the midst of that wilderness for Covenanters to have sought refuge, and perhaps quite a number of them gathered in a place like that, high up on the hill. Thank you. Any questions for me? I'd be happy to take people to see, well, the easiest ones to get to would be the one, the wee chapel, the hiding place in Earlston Wood, or the one at Blackwater. The others are a bit more of an expedition, but happy to answer any questions. Well, you're welcome to ask me questions later.
Okay, thank you. Right, our next personality is Ted Cowan, who's known to many as an expert on Scottish history. So he's going to give us a little bit of further adventures of what happened really after to the Covenanters.
I've got on exactly the same shirt the day that I had when we made the show. I've only got 2 shirts. What I'm going to try and do is just a few pointers here. One of the things, the first thing I'd like to say is that I've been campaigning for years to get the name of this rebellion here called correctly the Glenkens Rebellion. I used to live in Pennycook, and right behind us was the field, the battlefield. And the guy who named this affair was Robert Lee Stevenson. And of course he grew up around that part of the world, and he was always returning to it, so on. So he just thought he'd slip it in, and became that. But now, thanks to Jim and others, we managed to get this place. I just thought that when I saw it there tonight on the screen, and then when he was talking, that it's going to very soon be that nobody can call it anything else except the Glenkens Rebellion. And I think that's a good thing. However, one of the things that worries me a wee bit is that, and I'm aware of doing this myself, if I'm talking about the Glenkens rebellion around this part of the world, I tend to talk about that and nothing else. You know, it's important to remember, as David said actually, that the National Covenant was signed in 1648, wasn't it? We got the wrong date. Wait a minute.
1638.
What?
1638 was.
38, sorry, that's right. 1538. So, 1638, we're one of these times, it's terrible for a historian to be this dumb about dates. But the point I'm making is there's quite a gap between the advent, if you like, of the National Covenant and the outbreak of this rebellion here. And this was really a tiny affair in the general scheme of things. After all, in the period between 1638 and 66, there were umpteen battles, full-scale national and international battles fought between the Scots, the Covenanters, and the English, the troops at Cromwell, and so on. I was just thinking about that this afternoon, and it must amount to thousands of people that were killed. The Marquis of Montrose alone, in the course of his career, and it was only really lasted his physical career, if you like, his active career, it lasted only 1 year. The rest of the time he was doing other things. But in the year of his wonderful year, as it's called, when he fought against the, well, first of all, he fought against the Covenanters.